Job chapter 1. Who here has read Job or attempted to read Job? Who here made it through? Who here knew what was going on? All right. It can be, I was talking to Dusty earlier, it's hard because it's so long. And it's probably the oldest book in the Bible too. So that makes it challenging. But hopefully tonight we can kind of put it together. We're going to kind of look at an outline, maybe make it easier for us. So Job chapter 1, verse 1 says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning from evil. So Uz, whatever. Most people think that's like east of modern day Israel, probably South Syria, northern Jordan area. So that's kind of where this is taking place. And how is Job described right off the bat? Blameless. These are your blanks. Blameless. And blameless has the idea of integrity towards God. So Job was a man of integrity. It wasn't that he was perfect or sinless, but he had integrity. He owned his mistakes and got right with God. He was upright. And this means that he was just in his relationships. He treated people fairly and kindly. The next one is he feared God, which means he had true piety. True piety. So it wasn't like he was going through the religious motions, he wasn't just doing sacrifices to do sacrifices. He actually was a religious person. He feared God. And then the fourth description is he turned from sin. And this means that he was a devoted worshiper. He was not a half-hearted believer in God. So I put chapter 1 outlined for you to show you, instead of me trying to write it on the board. This is chiasm. Are you familiar with what a chiasm is in the world of literariness, whatever that is? So this is a literary device that helps you remember a story. So a lot of this stuff was oral tradition. So Old Testament narrative, they use a lot of these types of things to help pass stories on so they would remember. I think maybe it was last time we talked about bookends. Same kind of idea. So in a chiasm, you have A, and A corresponds down to A prime. So you work, as the story goes along, you're working your way into the chiasm, and you see it centers on E, and then it works its way back out. D prime corresponds to D, C prime to C, B prime to B, and A prime to A. And as you see, the correspondence is like, so Job's 10 children is B. B prime is Job loses his 10 children. So it starts off with his integrity. We just read verse 1. Verse 2, we're introduced to his 10 children. Verse 3, we get to see Job's prosperity. He's a rich dude, like probably the richest in that whole area, if not the world. D, we see that his children have feasts in verses 4 and 5. And then in E, verses 6 and 12, this is the point of a chiasm, is to focus in on the middle part of the story. And so all of a sudden you get a glimpse of, now you're in heaven and you see God, and there's a conversation between him and Satan. So that's drawing our attention to that part of chapter 1. And then it works its way back out. You see D prime is the children feasting. C prime, Job loses his prosperity. B prime, Job loses his 10 children. And those happen like boom, boom, boom when you read the story. Like while one guy is talking, another messenger comes and says, hey, you lost all your ox. And then, oh, you lost all your kids. Does anyone, this is totally extra credit, we talked about different types of grieving or griefs. What kind of grief would this be?
Example with ivy.
Loss.
It's a loss. You actually said it.
A combination of all of them?
It's cumulative, yeah. Cumulative. So remember, secondary is like the dominoes. You lose something, and that loss causes another loss, which causes another loss. And then this is compound or cumulative. This isn't necessarily that they're connected. It's just all of this stuff kind of happens and compounds on you. So this is an example of compound or cumulative grief that Job is. So that was free. But then A prime, the end of our chapter, verses 20 through 22.
Sherry.
It's okay. Get away with it.
Points off that too.
Yep. I'm gonna make a note of that.
Sorry.
You're good. So at the end of the chapter, we see Job's integrity again. Verse 3 says, "Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground, and he worshipped God." Verse 3, "When he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' And through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God." So we see Job's integrity right here. We see Job as a worshiper. Like we said, he turned from sin. He's a worshiper, blameless. He has integrity, upright, and feared God. So in the middle, though, what do we see Satan accusing God of? Like verse 9. "Then Satan answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You bless the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and surely he will curse you to your face.'" So what's he accusing God of?
Favoritism.
Yeah?
Did he bought him?
He buys worship. And that's the thing. God buys his worship. That's what Satan's telling God. Of course he's upright. Of course he fears you. Because you give him everything he could ever want. Who wouldn't worship a God that gives you everything? Big family, a lot of kids. You're the richest dude in the neighborhood. Like, why would he not take those things away, and he will curse you? And there's a little thing going on with the word curse is actually the word bless. And people think that's because the writer didn't want to actually use the word curse there. But so he won't worship you, but what does he do? After God allows Satan to come in and take everything, create this compound or cumulative grief, what is Job's response?
Still thinks he's...
He worships. Job's integrity in verses 20 through 22 is seen in his worship. So chapter 2. So now we're kind of like in the middle of the story again. We're back in heaven. I say round 2 with Satan. So Satan shows up, and I don't know, it's almost like God's trolling him or something. I don't know why God does this, but it's for his glory. Verse 3, "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless, upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause.'" It's important, the part where it says without cause. Even God's saying this was not warranted. This is all without cause. And Satan says, verse 4 and 5, "Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face.'" So what's his accusation against Job in chapter 2? So skin for skin is kind of a weird phrase. It's even weirder in ancient archaic Hebrew. But most think it means like your life, skin for skin. So that's what he cares only for his life. So he's like, well, yeah, he has integrity. He keeps worshiping you because you didn't harm him personally. And Job's the kind of guy that, you could do all these other things to other people, but as long as he's good, he's fine. Skin for skin type of thing. And so God says, all right, you can touch him. You just can't take his life. And so we see him inflict Job. In verse 10, it says, verse 9, after he scraped his sores off, then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So, and another thing, going back to his integrity in verse 20 and 21 and all that, it says he tore his robe and shaved his head. And I forgot to make the point there, that was an outward expression of his heart being torn. So back in the day, they would, tear their cloaks, and that was their way of saying, this is grief. I'm torn inside, so this is... and then the ashes and all that stuff, and shaving his head, that's so other people would see that he's mourning. He's going through something. And so now his wife tells him to curse God, and still he doesn't. He keeps his integrity. Now he has 3 friends show up: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they sit with him for 7 days and no one speaks. And something happens within these 7 days. So in chapters 1 and 2, he has his integrity, he's worshiping, he's not sinning. Something happens in these 7 days, and then verse 3 opens up, and it's a lament. Job is poetry form, but Job is lamenting. And listen for themes. We've been talking a lot about themes, I know. So listen for what themes you might hear. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. We'll start at verse 3. He says, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let God not above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, let darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful shout enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are prepared to rouse Leviathan. Let the stars of its twilight be darkened. Let it wait for the light, but have none. And let it not see the breaking dawn, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb, or hide trouble from my eyes." What theme kept popping up? Darkness. Yeah. So what Job is saying is he's arguing for a reversal of creation. So we saw in the first 2 lessons, kept kind of harping on what we saw in creation, right? What is God doing? He's coming in, he's subduing the darkness and the chaos in the sea. And now Job's arguing because he's going through so much and doesn't understand what God's doing. He's arguing for God to just reverse it all. It'd be better for none of this to have happened. If this is what life is about, let's just rewind the tape and not start it.
But is he talking to his friends here and not to God? Or
Well, it says, I don't know. I think it's just a lament. So like Jeremiah, we're going to see him in 2 weeks. Like he's got laments in his. And so, let's see, it's just call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? And to which of the holy ones will you turn? For the anger slays the foolish man. Oh, I'm reading chapter 5. I'm like, this is not what I remember reading. Oh, it says, after Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. So I think Job is just lamenting in front of his friends. I don't think he's talking to God. But he will.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk more about laments. Laments are a genre in the Psalms, especially. Psalm 88 is what's called a pure lament. It's the only one found. And it's just a poem of your grief. So, and also it's talked about Leviathan. We didn't talk about this, but like in Psalm 74, it talks about creation also. It talks about how God, when he was fighting the sea, he crushed the head of Leviathan. So he's usually fighting the sea monster with the sea. So that's another theme there that wasn't as obvious as darkness. But he's saying Leviathan there is the sea. All right, chapter 3 is the lament. His friends show up. Now this is where we can kind of look at an outline. So chapter 4, they start, and you're going to see 3 cycles of his friends. And his friends are just, we're going to see bad theology of suffering tonight. So 4 through 14 will be the first cycle, chapters 4 through 14. But Eliphaz, his big thing, the friends, like you could sum it all up, they say, Job, you're suffering because you caused it. This is your fault. You wonder why you're suffering? It's because you've done something. Eliphaz's argument is, you've sinned in the past. You've done something to really tick God off. And you don't know, but you better figure it out type of thing. You've messed up. That's his advice. That's why he thinks. Because Job doesn't understand. Because remember, Job's suffering without cause. He doesn't know what he's done. He doesn't think he's done anything to warrant this level of suffering. Bildad says, you're suffering because you won't admit your past sin. So he's saying that you're just self-righteous. There's some sin that you've had in the past and you won't deal with it. Zophar, which I can't tell if that's a cool name or a dumb name, but Zophar, I guess it depends on how cool he is. I don't know. Anyway, Zophar says, you deserve this. He just flat says like, man, you're getting what you deserve. I don't know what you did, but you deserve it. That's how God works. You've done something, you're just getting judgment. So in chapters 4 through 14, this cycle of these 3 friends making their arguments is there, and then it starts over in 15 through 21. Then you get another cycle of his 3 friends arguing these points to him, and Job interacts with them throughout. And then the 3rd cycle is 22 through 31. And that's the final cycle of him talking with his friends. And they had a false theology. One, what we see from them is they believe that a sinful person will always suffer visibly. So if you see somebody and they're going through something, they're a sinner. And you're getting to witness this, and this is their shame. It's like putting a scarlet letter on them, so everybody knows that they've done something bad. 2, a person suffering is always a sinful person. So when you see someone suffering, it's always a result of their sin. Prosperity, blessing, always means God's favor. This is bad theology of suffering. This is also just bad theology. Have you heard of the prosperity gospel? This is it in ancient form. The belief that you can earn God's favor through good works, but not just good favor. You earn like blessings, and you can name something and claim it, and then God is bound to give it to you because you've done it in faith. So the flip side of that would also be true if that's true. If 3 is true, then 4 would be true, which is no prosperity or blessing always means the person has fallen out of favor with God. Now, are any of these true? No. And the key is always. You could suffer because of sin, right? Sin has consequences, right? And you dabble in a lifestyle of sin for long, you're going to reap those consequences, right? You sow what you reap. You reap what you sow. But you don't always, right? Their whole point is these always happen. You know, I think it's easy to look around in intense and prolonged times of suffering or trials to doubt God's love. I think when, at least in my experience, when things come up in life, it's like, no big deal. It's me and God. We got this. And you face it, you get through it, move on, and then something else pops up. But for those big things that are intense and or prolonged seasons of suffering where it's just doesn't feel like God's moving the needle and you're just kind of stuck in this is Job, he's just stuck in this place. He talks about God putting a hedge around him. And I felt that too in my life. It feels like God has like rolled you in and it's like there's no way out. And it's easy in those times to look at your circumstances, bad or even good circumstances when things are going well, to think that God's love is somehow connected. So like our circumstances are not the measure of God's love is what I'm saying. What is the measure of God's love? What is something we always go back to measure God's love for us? Yeah. I was looking for alliteration, but you got the right answer. The cross. Don't look at your circumstances, look to the cross. But yeah, we look to Jesus. Romans 8:32 says that God did not spare even his own son, but delivered him over on our behalf. That's how much God loves you. I do not love anybody that much. That I would be like, you know what, you sinner, I'm going to hand over my one and only son who I love so you can live because you hate me. That's God. We all hate him. We're all enemies of him. But he didn't spare his own son. Job's false theology of suffering. This is called presumption theology. Presumption. And I think we all struggle with this to a degree. I know this was my theology for pretty much my life until 18 or 19. So the definition is, it presumes that there's a law of fairness or justice that God himself is bound to keep. And this assumes that God is unjust if he appears not to act fairly. So if God's not playing by the rules, if he's not following this law of fairness, then God is somehow unjust. That's obviously false, right? There's no law that says God has to act fairly or he's bound to your definition of fairness is what I'm saying.
But do you think people have that aspect because they aren't founded in the Word?
I think everybody has that because I think it's just being human and knowing how relationships work. Everything is kind of merit-based. So like, I don't know how early on, but you learn like, you do good things happen, you do bad things happen, which is a natural law of consequences, but then you kind of carry that over into relationships. You know, I'm going to talk about it at the end, but I had this theology, I call it scratch my back theology. So if I do something good for God, then he's got to do something good for me, because that's only right, because that's how we work. I do something good for my neighbor, then he should do something good for me. This is kind of the world we live in. We I'm glad I'm not a business person because so much is networking. I'm the worst networker. This is like probably why I don't have a lot of options for a job right now. Because in seminary, I didn't want to be those guys that followed the professor around because I didn't want them to think I was using them to get ahead in any way. And so I kind of erred on that side of I don't want anyone to ever think that's the kind of person I am, that I'm using somebody. But it's tough because that's kind of how the business world works, is you make those connections and you know, you do something for them and now they owe you a favor and you can come to them and they're like, you helped me out, so I'll help you out. So I think that's kind of why we approach God with this idea that we interact, our relationship with him is kind of just like all of our relationships and how they work, but that's not how God works. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So, yeah, so, you know, my kids, you're the grandma. My twins are 8, and they live by this law of presumption theology. They presume that everything is supposed to be fair or right. This morning, in the laundry room for school. They're in there, and Elliot picks up a shirt out of the laundry. Harper walks in like a half second late, said, I wanted to wear that shirt. And it's like one of the two things that they don't have copies of. And so then Harper like does a donkey kick to the dryer. It's like, that's not fair. And I'm like, I don't know why you think there's this law of fairness right now. She picked it up first. That seems fair, but there's always this, I don't know how your kids are, but there's always this is not fair. And I don't know how many times I've said, life's not fair. Let me correct your bad theology. Life is not fair. So this is Job's theology. He presumes that if he's doing everything right, and that's not why he's done everything right, but he's just looking at his life and thinking, I've done everything right. I've had good motives. I've done the right thing. Why would God be doing this? He must be unjust. So Job's bad theology led his confusion. Who is God that he would do this to him without cause? Is he unjust? And Job, so we saw in chapter 2 where God admitted that the suffering Job was going through was without cause. And then chapter 9, verse 17, Job says, God multiplies my wounds without cause. So even Job recognizes that this is not fair, and so God is unjust. So he's having a crisis of faith, basically. He doesn't know. His idea of who God is isn't matching up with how God is playing. You know what I mean? And that's why, from the very beginning, I've said it's so crucial that we know who God is so we don't find ourselves in a Job situation. So Job's bad theology led him to sin in his suffering. So he started out great. He didn't sin. In both those, it says, in chapter 1, it says he didn't accuse God, and then the second one in chapter 2 says he didn't sin with his lips. The idea is he's not calling God wicked or unjust. He's just worshiping God. But in chapter 34, verse 10, he calls God wicked. 34 verses 36 and 37, it says that Job rebelled. 35 verses 15 and 16 talks about Job's pride and arrogance. So as the suffering got intense and prolonged, and God wasn't showing up to answer his prayers, I'm sure, to relieve him of his suffering, he assumes, well, God is just unjust. He's wicked. So Elihu. So this is a fourth friend. He's not mentioned with the other three, and he talks about how he's younger. So I think he was just tagging along maybe, and he talks about how he kept his mouth shut because he realizes there's age here and there's wisdom with age, so he was going to listen before he spoke up, but he just heard all this nonsense for 3 cycles, and now we're in chapter, 32, and he's like, I can't sit here and listen to this anymore. So in chapters 32 through 37, we see Elihu's counsel. And what we see is he agrees with Job that Job did not cause his suffering. He agrees. He's like, you didn't do anything to cause this. You didn't sin. You didn't do any of that. This is without cause. But you're still suffering. And then he points out to Job that in his suffering, his bad theology has caused him to sin. So you didn't cause this suffering, but in your suffering, it has caused you to sin. So your sin didn't cause it, but it has caused you to sin. And then what he does is crucial. He points Job back to who God is. And that's chapters 36 and 37. He goes into who God is. But we get a lot of good stuff out of those chapters of Elihu's, I don't know, I can't. We get, I list them there, reasons for suffering. So there's not one reason why we suffer. How do you all see these, or how have you seen these kind of work out in your life? Have you seen it in that it prevents sin? Or has suffering corrected sin? I know a big one is it teaches us about God, right? That's a big one. For me, it forces greater dependence on God because I realize I don't have what it takes to do it on my own. Definitely gives focus to priorities. Even a bad stomach bug will get your priorities straight. I don't know if you had a stomach bug. You start thinking holy thoughts. Lord, let this pass quickly. So it can get your thoughts and your priorities on track. And suffering can be a judgment for sin. Hebrews 12 talks about that. A loving father disciplines his children because he loves them, right? He doesn't want them living in such a way that's going to harm them, so he disciplines them.
Elihu.
I think I have a hard time saying that because there's Eli, I have Eli, he's my son, and I have Elliot, and we call her Ellie. So when I say Elihu, I feel like I'm talking about a girl. So every time I say Elihu, I'm like, that's not right. Elihu? No, Elihu. I'm going to start calling Elliot Elihu. She's going to hate that.
Yeah. That's a boy's name.
No, she wouldn't. All right. I've listed out 4 flaws that are just throughout the book. I didn't want to list like a huge list, but here's just some that I think are big. And I just put them because these are the ones that are kind of personal to me. That one, these are flaws that we can have about God. One is that God is silent in our suffering. And it feels like he doesn't answer our prayers, or he, we ask why a lot, but it doesn't feel like he's indicating at all why this is going on. And so it just feels like God is very distant. He's just quiet. When you want him to show up and explain it in comfort, it just feels very alone. Number 2, God is unjust. And I think this goes back to our own presumption theology. Because we know God is just. There's nothing he does that is wicked or unholy. He is not doing things out of cruelty or because he hates us or because we've fallen out of favor. But it feels like that because we're so used to, especially like us. We're here on a Wednesday night. Look at us. It's been a rainy day and it's dark and home sounds comfortable and warm, right? But we want to learn about God. We want to grow in our relationship with him. We want to grow in the knowledge of his word. So we're here. We come to church on Sunday. I'm sure we all pray. We do these things that the world doesn't do, and we're like, when something happens, it can be easy for us to be like, God, this isn't fair. I'm checking all the boxes off. Why are you doing this? And those are okay. It's okay to feel that way, but it's like Job. He starts accusing God of wickedness, and that's where we don't want to go because we know God is not wicked. 3, God is not merciful. If he loved me or loved my loved one who might be hurting or suffering, then he would heal, or he would stop the suffering, or something along those effects. He would have mercy. Sure, God, you can take it so far, but after that, you need to stop. You need to show mercy. And when, again, in times of intense and prolonged suffering or trials, it's easy to be like, and if you notice, these are going back to chapter 1 when we talked about the attributes and character of God. Like, these are the things that we need to plant in our head because suffering will make us doubt all of these attributes of who God is. He's merciful. The 4th one, God does not care. He cares about others. It's easy to look around and be like, he cares about them. it can feel like you're forgotten. Like, he cares about them, but he doesn't care about me. I guess he just doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm over here just wallowing. I feel forgotten by God. So these are flaws. These are just some that I picked out from the book of Job. One, I think it's good because we can identify with Job if we can read all these chapters. So that's comforting to know that this dude, who knows how old this book is ancient. But even back then, suffering looks exactly the same. The same struggles are the same today with God. The same flaws that he encountered are the flaws that we can avoid because of his story. All right. Chapter 38 is when God shows up. And chapters 38 and like 39 and 40, I don't know if you've ever read those. Those are pretty awesome to read. Some of my favorite chapters. If you can't make it through the book of Job, you're like stuck in like the teens or the 20s. You're like, I'm losing interest. I don't know what's going on. Just skip to 38 and 39 because you know that's awesome. And terrifying because if God showed up in a whirlwind, I'd wet myself. So God's counsel. God says that God is not unjust because you suffer unjustly. We see that in his book. He says Job is suffering without cause. Job knows he's suffering without cause. Elihu says you're suffering without cause. Or Elihu says you're suffering without cause. But that doesn't mean that God is unjust. And the second thing is you cannot declare what you do not understand. And if you read through Elihu's counsel, over and over he's saying you speak without knowledge. Like, you just run your mouth like you know what you're talking about, but you don't know who God is. Like, the way you're talking about him is like down here and God is up here. Like, you don't know what you're saying. And God backs him up here when he shows up. He's like, you're declaring things that you have no knowledge about when it comes to who God is. And I think this is our main point in the book of Job. When we suffer without cause, we're to continue to worship without cause. Do you know what I mean by worship without cause? Because we do have cause to worship, right? We worship God in response to what he's done for us through his son, right? That's a cause to worship. So what do I mean by we worship without cause?
Not knowing the outcome.
Yeah, like a Job situation. We don't worship because we're bought. We don't worship because we think God owes us. Or we don't worship because of, if I worship him, then he's going to help me get that raise, or he's going to, whatever it might be in your world, or he's going to...
Out of pure reverence.
Yeah, we worship because it's who we are. It's who he created us to be. I skipped down on one there. But we worship not merely as an activity. We do worship as an activity, but that's not what our worship is. Worship must be realized as part of our identity. When we know that's who we're created to be, that's what we're meant to do, then we look like Job in chapter 1 and 2. We just worship. We don't curse God. We just worship because that's who we are and that's why we were created. God's worthy of the worship regardless of our circumstances. God's worthy of our worship even when we don't understand God completely or what God's doing in our life. He's still worthy. And you can only have that realized part of your identity if you know the object of your worship. If you have a high view of God, your faith's going to rise to that. If you have a shallow view of God, you're going to have a shallow faith. Any questions about worship? I feel like that could be confusing. Worship without cause? What about Jesus? So I just wanted to make that clear. How was the mission of God advanced through Job? Let's talk for a second. see how, I know you guys did well in your quiz. I haven't looked at them yet, but I'm sure you guys got A++++. What have we been talking about in the last two, but really the last lesson, the Missio Dei? We said that there was, this in verse 2 of Genesis, right? And then God creates the world as we know it. And then he'll create a new heavens and a new earth. So this is the goal. He's moving that direction. He subdued chaos, all that stuff. Creation was good. Satan, the creature, flipped creation up on its head. Now evil and sin and all death has entered the world. And that's where we live. And we said that this world appears to have been created for God to defeat evil once and for all. And so God, at just the right time, entered the world, sent his son, the Messiah, the ascending of God, and then he has left. He did his death and resurrection, and he's back at the right hand of the Father, and he has sent us into the world, right? So this is the mission that's going on. God has been advancing, and we're looking at the oldest book in the Bible. This is old school here. So God has been advancing his mission all the way back in ancient times. How is Job's story doing that today for us? Because we're the ones being sent by God.
Has he had faith even though he was suffering?
Mm-hmm. So his faith in chapters 1 and 2 for sure give us a model of faith.
Even though his friends were telling him he shouldn't have
but
faith.
even in his confusion, even though he wasn't listening to his friends, he was still confused on who God was because he was looking at his circumstances, right? So we can identify with him. So he's an encouragement to us now as we are going through life, trying to advance the mission. And we saw that Jesus' mission was not without suffering. He died. That's pretty bad. And as disciples, he tells us we're supposed to do what? Lose our life. Physically, if it has to come to that, but he means priority-wise. We lose living for ourselves. And that is a loss. And so that is suffering. It's the loss of anything. I put that it prepares us disciples to accept unjust suffering as an act of worship like Jesus did. So Jesus, he offered himself as a sacrifice on our behalf, right? A sacrifice is an act of worship. And this act of worship was him offering himself in our place, the just for the unjust. So his suffering is worship, but it's also unjust that he would suffer for our sin. But he did it because he loves us. And so Jesus is an example, obviously, as disciples for us to model our faith by. When something happens in life and we feel like it's not fair and we don't get the why answer from God, we have Job as a story that God's given us to tell us that just because it seems unfair or unjust doesn't mean that God is unfair or unjust, and that we are to worship without cause because God has created us as worshipers. And we could talk a lot about how suffering can really show us the object of our worship. We're going to worship regardless. It can be God, it can be ourselves, it can be money, it can be anything. It can be kids, it can be a career. We're going to find something to worship. And a lot of people go through things and they end up worshiping the wrong thing to help them get through it. But Job helps us to see that we're to worship God no matter what. So 1 Peter 3:18, that was in the last one, I think, but it's, for Christ died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust. And having been put to death in the flesh, and made alive in the spirit. All right, here's a preview. The next lesson we're going to look at Jonah, and he suffered unwillingly. and we're gonna see what we can learn from him. So this one, you probably saw it. This is an example of someone who believed in God but suffered unfairly. And so that's gonna happen at times. So we gotta learn what to do when that arises. We're gonna see kind of what not to do from Jonah. Jonah is the guy that suffered unwillingly, and he caused a lot more problems for himself because he didn't accept God's will in that. After that, we'll see Jeremiah. Jeremiah is kind of the flip of Jonah. He's the one that suffered obediently. You guys have read Jeremiah, or at least tried. It's another one of those long ones. But that poor guy, even when he tried not to, he still had to. He's like, it burns in me. I have to preach or speak God's word. I can't keep it in. It's like burning his insides, what he says. So he's going to be the flip of Jonah, and then we'll see others. And the idea is to look at these different characters in the Bible in their unique situation, learn from it, so that no matter what we're going through, because we're like, I don't know how many people in here, but we can represent a number of different ways to suffer, but all those ways we want to stay on mission. We want God to use us to advance his mission that he started in defeating evil. Put down some exercises you can do. You know, when you have time, take some time to think about your own presumption theology. I think we all have it to a degree. And like I mentioned earlier, mine was, I called it scratch my back theology. So what that looked like was somewhere, I believed in Jesus when I was 9, and somewhere from 9 to like 18, I developed this theology that is my relationship with God is based on works. Not to earn salvation, but to earn blessing. And
So how did you hear that?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying, being raised in church and going and being involved, they didn't teach you that theology,
What
did
the
they?
church is in at that age?
Well,
Guys, I don't know. I was trying to think about it. I'm like, was there because I can think of my Sunday school teachers, Charles and all those guys, and I don't ever remember them saying this is how God works. But I think that's just how the world, relationships in the world work. And so I think that just, as a kid or a teenager, 12, 13, whatever, 10 years old, I think I just started seeing how the world works in relationships and just kind of imported that into how my relationship with God should work. You know what I mean? But you have to admit, like, growing up Baptist, we weren't really discipled. You know, even you, it wasn't until I was in college that we really all started going to JB, and we started actually putting things together, and been in church our whole life and never seen certain things. So I don't know how that happened, but I do know it did. And as you know, it led to a huge crisis of faith. So I think I was 17 or 18. I come downstairs, and then she's by the sink, and I'm like, I don't think I believe in God anymore. Yeah. And I was serious
I
because
was not ready for that.
because what led to that was like I said, I've been checking the boxes off. I hated Wednesday night youth, but I went. You know what I mean? I didn't mind Sunday mornings. I could have slept in, but I went. You know, I did the right things. I was doing what was expected. I was scratching God's back, and so I expected God to be like, well, Eric, because you're so holy, let me help you. What is your request today? And so it's kind of like a genie in the bottle. I'd go to God and I'd say, you know what? I don't understand why I'm not winning any golf tournaments. I played golf growing up. Why am I not winning any golf tournaments? I prayed like 2 seconds before I teed off that he would help me win. Like, why is it, my brain's like not computing why God would be doing this. And then it kind of culminated, like, me constantly over the years seeing that God doesn't play by this game that I thought was how he played. So I thought he was unjust, and I thought he wasn't fair, and I knew that isn't who God is, so then God must not be real. And it kind of culminated in high school when I had a lot of physical pain. I had a big surgery when I was in 9th grade, and I didn't recover like I thought I would. So I was in physical pain. I wasn't able to play golf anymore. I could barely walk 9 holes. So I had to quit golf for a while, and then a girl broke my heart. So then I have emotional pain. And so all these things that I valued as a teenager or whatever, God was taking away, and I was mad at God because I was like, I don't do the big sins, right? I don't drink, I don't party, I don't do the sex, I don't, like, all the big ones that all the other kids are doing, I'm not doing. I'm going to Wednesday night youth.
That I hate.
Yeah, that I don't even want to be at. Sacrifice. But so I felt God was being cruel because he wasn't scratching my back. And so I thought, well, God can't be cruel. So then God must not be real. And so I had it. And so that's when I went down in the kitchen. I was like, put a lot of thought into this. I don't think God's real. And I don't remember what happened after that. I feel like that was like, if it was a movie, the music just went. But obviously, God.
Was that when Jackson and Amber were there?
I think Amber was there. I think you were in shock. Amber, my sister, was probably a little more like, you can't do that. I just cannot believe it. I won't let you do that.
That storyline, do good for God, it's everywhere. It's in movies, it's in songs, you hear it from just people.
It's in most theology.
It's everywhere.
That's why I mentioned the prosperity gospel. Like that's wrecked a lot of faith. But I said, you know what, God, I would really hate to die and stand before you and have got this one wrong. So I said, I'm going to do everything I can to allow you to reveal yourself to me. And so I jumped in every Bible study I could. I actually would open my Bible and read it. So I used to, it was like, I'm going to read. I get like a chapter, maybe a chapter, and I'm like, okay, let me go win a golf tournament. You know what I mean? There was no like looking for God in the scriptures, just again, checking off a box. And so I actually started reading. I remember I started in Matthew and I read Matthew, and all of a sudden, like, I saw Jesus in a completely different way. I was like, Jesus, I kind of had an attitude in high school. I got in some fights I probably shouldn't have been getting into. Don't laugh, Daniel. He was my friend in high school.
He probably saved you from a few.
He probably did. Daniel was a good kid. I was the bad influence. But I started seeing Jesus as like in these confrontations with the Pharisees, and he wasn't real nice about it. Like, he was real clever and sarcastic. I was like, I like this Jesus. So I started getting more into it, and I just started seeing things that I had heard my whole life in Sunday school, Wednesday night youth, and it actually started making sense and clicking, and I started actually getting to know God, not just about God, but getting to know him. And in that, I was like, then that's when the grace message hit about that time. And I was like, man, I need to go to seminary. It didn't really happen that fast, but that's what happened. I was like, I gotta tell people about this. Because I wanted people who have been reading their Bible their whole life and it's just kind of boring. I wanted to be able to open it up and show them things that maybe they've never seen before. And hopefully the Spirit would like come in their life the way he did and transform them like he did me. So that was my presumption theology. Yours could be totally different, but I think there's something there that might hinder how we view God. Some presumptions about him, how he works that might not be from his word, that could get us in trouble. All right. Any questions? Are you ready for the quiz answers?
I do have another question.
Okay.
Okay, so
I'm going to send this and you guys can start taking pictures.
how do I say this?
That's always a good way.
Waiting. Okay, so I would have to say that I've had a pretty strong faith. We've lived through a lot with you and diseases and
I was listening to the audio. That was me throwing
the eraser.
The dry eraser.
Okay, so I would say that my faith was pretty strong. I knew who God was and is, but then yet when difficult times came, I'm not questioning my faith, but yet I'm still somewhat questioning God. So, is that a sin when you're questioning God?
No.
about like,
That's
why
just
are
you
you
being
letting this
confused.
happen?
Yeah, that's totally natural. And I think those are healthy questions because that is kind of that dialogue that you have in your quiet time or whatever in your relationship with God that you can work through and He can answer down the road and build your faith. If that makes sense. So those questions of doubt aren't sin. I don't think they're sin. I think those are, like, think of the guy in the Bible who said, I believe, help my unbelief. I think we have a faith that takes us so far, and then we don't know where to go in certain situations because we've never been there before. And it's kind of what I talked about at the beginning of the first lesson, how like we should have like compassion and stuff for each other because we've all gone through different things. And some might have gone through really intense seasons of suffering, and some people may have just stubbed their toe on the bed, and that could be the worst pain they've ever had. But in all those things, as a believer, you're wrestling with that with God. And like, God takes you a little, and as you grow in faith, He takes your faith a little further to where it's never been before. And then you're like, I've grown from that. And then when something else happens, you can be like Eli, like, well, it's not like crushing my fingers, you know, because God's taken my faith to that point. So it's okay to question. Job's sin was he got arrogant, self-righteous, and he accused God of being wicked and unjust. It's okay to be like, God, I don't understand. This seems unfair. That's okay. It's not a sin.
I hate to say it, but I feel like suffering is so necessary, especially for me. Like, the best things in my life were post-suffering. You know, the best things that happened in my life. I found my faith, found my wife. I discovered what discipleship was after suffering, when I had a better perspective on life.
Yeah. No, I agree. When we get towards the end, we're going to look at suffering and discipleship. You cannot be a disciple and grow in your faith without suffering. It can't happen. The very definition of being a disciple is one who loses their life. Remember, suffering is the loss of anything. So by definition of being a disciple, you're a suffering one. And that's why Mark is so good, because Mark portrays Jesus as the ultimate disciple. Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. It's just not, he's not just an example of servanthood, he's an example of the ultimate disciple. And that's why if you read it, the disciple, Mark really like makes the disciples look bad. Because he's doing this juxtaposition of Jesus is the example of discipleship.
Well, Jesus did no bad, but yet he questioned God on the cross.
Oh, and
my God,
like, why have you forsaken me?
me? That's a question.
It is, and there's a lot of books on that. Because that he's quoting Psalm 22, verse 1. And so they didn't have, like in the Old Testament, they didn't have, like, open up to Job chapter 1. They didn't do that. Or Psalm chapter 22. So what they would do is they'd quote the first line of that passage. And so that was how you knew where they were going. And when he quotes Psalm 22:1, he's directing everyone's attention to that psalm, in which, if you read it and open up like the Passion scene in the Gospels next to it, and it's almost he's fulfilling it, like I'm not gonna say real time, but like line by line, it's like a fulfillment of everything going on. So I think he's nodding to that and saying that he's fulfilling that passage in the Old Testament. And there's other things going on there too. But again, that's what the books are for.